Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, November 13th, 2020. And I consider this a fortuitous day because here in Northern California, a steady rain is falling. Well, we've had a few sprinkles, but this is the first front of the season. And it means that fire season is over. Now, I'm just calling that myself. I'm not sure the officials would join me in that, but I am hopeful that we have seen the last of this year's wildfires here in the Golden State. And this weekend, I think, is going to be critical. As I warned you the other day, the Oath Keepers and other Trump supporters, armed militants, are gathering in Washington, D.C. and across the country. And while we get very mixed reports about whether Trump is really into this long-shot fight to hold on to the presidency, or if he's actually thrown in the proverbial towel. But his supporters are standing by, just like he told the Proud Boys to do in the debate. And people on the far right of the wackadoodle spectrum, like Congressman Louis Gohmert of Texas, like the newly minted Congresswoman from Georgia, who likes QAnon and doesn't like to wear masks, Marjorie Taylor Greene, they are some of the speakers who will be joining up in Washington, D.C., along with Trump defender Sebastian Gorka. He briefly served in the White House and is now featured nightly on the Sinclair TV stations across the country, and he has a right-wing syndicated radio show. Of course, it's called America First. And there's a whole litany of other people supporting this. What is interesting, as Linda Lewis pointed out to me, she escaped from Washington to Dallas a few years ago, but she explained that the venue they've chosen is very small. So it is intended to make it look like 1 million MAGAs marched, when maybe it'll be 1,000 or a couple of thousand. Who knows? There is some caravan organized by the InfoWars team led by Alex Jones on its way to D.C. from Texas. And right-wing media has been very active in stoking the false claims of voter fraud. We do have one case of voter fraud. I'm going to share that with you in a few minutes here. It's pretty exciting. And this woman took Trump's advice. I'll leave it at that for now. But the New York Times got some Media Lab people at MIT. They have a new tool called Radio Search. I haven't heard of this before. But they used it to analyze the verbiage on the Rush Limbaugh show this week. And Rush only made it once. He was there on Monday. He took the rest of the week off to treat his terminal cancer. But on Monday, he said there's plenty of fraud that took place. There's simply no way Joe Biden was legitimately elected president. I just can't believe it, he said. And I heard him say that. He didn't offer any evidence. It's just his own belief, just like Trump said from April forward, that if he loses, it will have been rigged. And I would add, as you've heard me say frequently, if he won, it was because of rigging. They didn't do enough rigging. And I'm sure that there's great infighting among the Trump glitterati about that issue. So this week, Rush and his substitute hosts mentioned election fraud 204 times. That's 10 times more than the word came up in the 8 days before the election. And essentially, it has replaced the discussion of Hunter Biden, which was front and center in the days before the election and now is barely mentioned. So these rallies across the country, under the banner of Stop the Steal, we're told there are dozens of cities that will feature these gatherings. And we don't know what's going to happen. Will Trump send signals on Twitter or elsewhere for his palace guard to show their muscle, beat up some libtards? It's very hard to predict. But the chemistry is there. The kindling has been placed. And all it takes is a spark. And I'm vigilant about this. I do not want to be promoting and stoking fear or any unfounded concerns. But I think we need to be vigilant. We need to be aware that this could be going on. So Nick Turse, writing at The Intercept today, corrects our lingo a little bit. And he points out that Trump really can't conduct a coup because he is the guy who's currently in power. But Turse quotes an assistant professor, Erica de Bruin, who teaches at Hamilton College. She's the author of How to Prevent Coups. And she defines the terms for us. A coup attempt involves an illegal, overt effort by civilian or military elites to remove a sitting executive from power. But the term of what we're actually facing here, and I do have to begrudgingly say that Bill Maher has been warning about this for several years now. But the term is autogolpe, A-U-T-O-G-O-L-P-E, which typically involves leaders remaining in office beyond their term by suspending the Constitution, shutting the courts, or ruling by fiat with the acquiescence of the military. And that sometimes can include a call for martial law or other forms of the suspension of the normal order. And I mentioned Bill Maher. It's always curious to me because I watch his show with interest. He can be very funny. He talks about current events. His politics pretty well suck. I mean, he used to come from a more libertarian perspective. But in the Trump era, he has doubled down with Democrats and spooks and promoting Russiagate. And he's just so goddamn smug. It's really hard to take. And I will acknowledge that some people might consider me to be smug. But I don't think that I'm in his league. So last Friday, one of Bill's guests was Rosa Brooks. She's a bright woman. She's a Georgetown University law professor. She worked at the Pentagon under the Obama administration. And she put together a group of 100 people that met 3 or 4 times over the past summer. And they called themselves the Transition Integrity Project. And they sat down and gamed out all the different ways that the campaign, the election could play out, and what Trump might do under different scenarios. And I have my own quibbles and questions about this group. It's loaded with neocons, Bill Kristol, David Frum, those types of people. And on the Bill Maher show, they listed her credentials, Georgetown professor, and then another time, it's called the lower third, when they put your name up there and your affiliation. And in the graphic on screen, it said, Transition Integrity Project. But Bill Maher never mentioned it, never asked her about it. She didn't bring it up. So I thought it was a huge missed opportunity. So with that, Rosa Brooks is saying that she doesn't think there is going to be some extra-legal effort by Trump to hold on to power. Why? Quote, Biden's win was just too big. It's hard to see them getting the departments and agencies at the Pentagon to go along. Now, I presume, because this article was just posted today, that Rosa Brooks made those comments after the purge and installation of Trump loyalists at the Pentagon this week. And I have to say that's what gives me my concern. And in this article, Nick Turse also quotes John Chin, who is at the Center for International Relations and Politics at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, co-author of a book called Historical Dictionary of Modern Coup d'etat. He said, from what I've seen so far, nothing reaches the level of what I would call a coup attempt, or more precisely, an auto golpe by President Trump. I just don't see Trump having that level of support within the military or sufficient backing in the courts to pull off the moves needed to stay in power. Well, I hope John Chin and Rosa Brooks are right. And Naomi Klein, also publishing at The Intercept, says that it's a possibility. It's remote, but it's something we should think about. And before I quote from Klein, I have to renew my complaints about her, about the way she joined forces with others to try to silence Michael Moore and the director of the film Planet of the Humans, released earlier this year. And more recently, Naomi Klein sided with the editors and Pierre Omidyar against Glenn Greenwald when he publicly resigned from his position at The Intercept. But I do respect Naomi Klein's long-term research into external forces that change governments, whether you call it the shock doctrine, the way that we interfere in other nations to promote market economies, busting of unions, opening of markets. Disaster capitalism is the other term she likes to use. So I do respect her on that. And she says, the tactic of taking minor voting irregularities and outlandishly inflating them to the level of election stealing, thereby justifying a very real coup d'etat, has been the go-to tactic in countless U.S.-backed regime change operations around the world, schemes supported by Republicans and Democrats alike. Do not tell yourself, she says, they are above bringing the tactic home. If the Republican Party refrains, and I believe it will, it won't be out of fealty to democracy, but rather out of loyalty to market and empire. If multiple state governments were to openly override the express will of their electorates, the result would be massive protest unrest, as well it should be. I'm not so sure about that. She continues, given the kind of profitable chaos Republicans and their donors have grown accustomed to under Trump, nothing can be ruled out. As David Sirota reported, these are not abstract fears. Most ominously, Republican lawmakers in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Arizona are already insinuating that the results may be fraudulent, even though they haven't produced any evidence of widespread fraud. And here's where I really agree with Klein. Given this reality, Biden's come-on-man approach of brushing off Republican election denialism as an embarrassment rather than a serious threat is probably a poor one. The Republican strategy, if they go down this road, relies on state legislators appealing to a perception, not a reality, that the public has lost faith in the election results. And that's a lot easier to claim if the only people screaming outside your office and bombarding you with phone calls and emails are Trump supporters shouting conspiracy theories about voter fraud. It is in this context that Democrats should be out there forcefully defending the integrity of the votes and condemning coup plotting for what it is. That means not waving it away as embarrassing, but, as Bernie Sanders has done, denouncing it as an outrage that is delegitimizing our electoral process and American democracy. The public should not wait for Democratic leaders to tell them it's time to fight back. Now to the voice of the New York Times and Maggie Haberman, the reporter who clearly has some of the best inside the White House sources. The headline reads, "He knows it's over. Out of the public eye, reality begins to set in." She cites a meeting like she was a fly on the wall Wednesday at the White House, where Trump proceeded to press his staff on whether Republican legislatures could pick pro-Trump electors in a handful of key states and deliver him the electoral votes he needs to change the math and give him a second term. Haberman continues, it was not a detailed conversation or really a serious one, nor was it reflective of any obsessive desire of Trump's to remain in the White House. One advisor, always anonymous, quote, he knows it's over. But instead of conceding, they said, he is floating one improbable scenario after another for staying in office while he contemplates his uncertain post-presidential future. According to interviews with a half-dozen advisors, there is no grand strategy at play. Trump is simply trying to survive from one news cycle to the next, seeing how far he can push his case against his defeat and ensure the continued support of his Republican base. And later, Haberman writes, advisors said his efforts were in keeping with one of his favorite pastimes, creating a controversy and watching to see how it plays out. Yeah, we're just part of his ant farm. As a next step, she says, Trump is talking seriously about announcing that he's planning to run again in 2024. And that would be inconvenient for a whole handful of people like Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Don Jr., Tom Cotton. There's a whole raft of, what's her name, former governor of Nikki Haley. She's raring to go. So if Trump announces he's going to run in 24, that puts a lot of these people into the sidelines. So in the meantime, I'm back to Haberman here. Trump has spent his days toggling between the White House residence and the Oval Office, watching television coverage about the final weeks of his presidency. His mood is often bleak, advisors say, though he is not raising his voice in anger, despite the impression left by his tweets, which are often in all capital letters. Several advisors have bluntly told Trump that the chances of changing the election's outcome are almost non-existent. And some advisors had hoped that Trump would accept the state of the race by the end of this week, but the looming Georgia recount may delay that. He really holds on to hope, don't he? Oh, and this surprised me. In a list of Republicans who are peeling off from Trump, we pick up a key name, Sheldon Adelson, the pro-Israeli Las Vegas casino owner, the guy who worked with the CIA to spy on Julian Assange at the embassy in London. Well, he used a third party. The Las Vegas, the News and Review, I think it's called, that he owns. The lead editorial of the paper said that it's time for Trump to accept that he lost. And those law firms that have been so deeply embarrassed by judges when they attempt to argue these bogus claims of election fraud, voter fraud, well, one of those firms, Porter, Wright, Morris, and Arthur, which has been leading the efforts to cast doubt on the election in Pennsylvania, they abruptly withdrew from a federal lawsuit that had filed just days earlier on behalf of Trump. This followed an article in the Times on Monday that described internal tensions at the firm, which is based in Columbus, Ohio. And China has fallen into line. Russia now the only holdout in congratulating Joe Biden on his victory and his expected inauguration coming up in January. And to the question of whether there is potential for this idea, and it involves going into, territory that's never been trod on before. Would a state legislature controlled by Republicans declare that the vote was corrupted, cannot be trusted, and then take it upon themselves to appoint all Trump electors to the Electoral College? Well, if we had a situation more like Florida 2000, where it all hinged on a single state, that would have more potential, in my view. But there's a good piece in today's New York Times under the bylines of Trip Gabriel and Stephanie Saul. And they analyze this. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, appears to be the biggest proponent of the idea. And is it legal? We don't really know. The Constitution gives state legislatures the power to determine the manner in which electors are appointed to the Electoral College. Every state has already done that by specifying in its laws that the winner of the statewide popular vote is entitled to the state's presidential electors. And earlier this year, the Supreme Court ruled that the electors must vote according to the state law, which in general is they have to vote according to the preference of the popular vote in that state. And then in general practice, governors certify electors chosen by the party. And so the questions are, can a Republican-controlled legislature make a move like this, and does it require the approval, or at least the absence of a veto, from the sitting governor, Democratic or Republican? And I want to thank Dick Atlee, who's a longtime listener from Maine. And he got down and sat down and put together a spreadsheet. And he laid out the states that he calls Republican trifecta, where it's Republican lower, Republican upper house, and a Republican governor. Then RRD, that is Republican holding the House and Senate and a Democrat in the governor's seat. And then he laid them out on this spreadsheet. And I'm not going to detail it for you today, but if we see this looming on the horizon, we will pull out Dick's spreadsheet and share his analysis with you. Now, one of the other factors that's limiting Trump's running room here is that they have filled in the electoral map of the United States. There are no longer any states that have not projected a winner. And today, Joe Biden claimed Georgia, 16 electoral votes. And Trump was acknowledged as the winner in North Carolina. That's 15 electoral votes, bringing Trump's total to 232, and he would need 270 to claim the presidency. Now, many right-wingers have been promoting suspicions and conspiracy theories, and I cannot explain why it took North Carolina until today to make that call, because I don't have the number in front of me, but Trump won it by a fairly wide margin. And I do believe that yesterday was the deadline for mail-in ballots to be received in North Carolina, but it didn't appear that they could have altered the outcome based on the vote tallies I saw just a few days ago. Now to the recount, which is now underway in Georgia, and we gave you some details about the confusion of the three different analytics that are being applied to the preliminary vote count in Georgia. But recounts don't generally find huge discrepancies that could change the outcome. A 2020 study of 31 recounts across various states found that on average, recounts shifted the vote margin by about 430 votes. The largest shift was in a Vermont 2006 auditor's race, in which the recount shifted the vote margin by 0.107%. That was 239 votes in Vermont. So it appears very unlikely. And there's also a recount called for in Wisconsin, and it doesn't seem like that will produce anything useful for Trump. And Arizona is sealed for Biden, and a new election lawsuit that was filed yesterday by the Arizona Republicans is being criticized by the Republican Attorney General of Arizona. The suit takes issue with the hand-count auditing process for ballots in Maricopa County, the state's largest. But the lawyers who wrote it seem confused about how the system worked, and when that was pointed out to them, the case was summarily dismissed. Also, a Michigan judge has rejected a Republican demand to delay certification of the vote count in Detroit. That slams another door on Trump and the Republicans. A Michigan judge rejected the request to delay that certification, saying he saw no convincing evidence of election fraud at a center for counting absentee ballots, and that the claims brought before him were not credible. Oh, and I mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene. She is the new congresswoman from Georgia, the Republican who sailed into office after winning the primary, and she's pro-Q and anti-mask. She was at her orientation session at the Capitol in Washington today and tweeted out her complaint. Our first session of new member orientation covered COVID in Congress, masks, masks, masks. I proudly told my freshman class that masks are oppressive. In Georgia, we work out, shop, go to restaurants, go to work and school without masks. My body, my choice. Hashtag free your face. And another nail in the proverbial coffin was yesterday, and I was surprised by this, but a group of federal, state, and local officials working with the Department of Homeland Security agency that was monitoring the security of the elections issued a report flatly stating that the election was the most secure in American history, and there's no evidence any voting systems were compromised. Now, I haven't seen the report itself. I've just seen news accounts, and nothing references anything about that dreaded interference by Russia, or more recently, the suspect was Iran. And we can all breathe a deep sigh of relief about that. There will not be a Russiagate in 2020. At least not so far. And I took a look last night. The agency is called CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's part of Homeland Security. And they have on their website, and I've put up a link in the show file for today's podcast if you'd like to take a look yourselves, at the rumor control page. And all of the rumors that they debunk are the ones that have been promoted by Trump and Don Jr. and Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and good old Project Veritas, James O'Keefe, that we took time to debunk yesterday. So the latest on the Erie, Pennsylvania postal worker is that he has, in fact, retracted his claims. There's no evidence to support what he initially said. That the gambit yesterday to blame the Dominion voting systems, which have their problems. But these officials have found that software problems did not affect final vote counts. And Trump's new favorite network, now that he's no longer a Foxy guy, is the One American News Network, or, it's OAN. Well, they have been pumping out a series of videos, including false claims about the integrity of the vote, in order to provide cover for Trump. So here it is. Prepare yourselves. There is one actual case of voter fraud in the United States. 55-year-old Des Moines, Iowa resident Terry Lynn Rote was booked Thursday on a first-degree charge of election misconduct. She was released after posting $5,000 bond. She admits that she voted twice. She says, "I don't know what came over me." She said she hadn't planned on it, but it was this spur-of-the-moment thing. She walked by a satellite voting location, even though she had already mailed in a ballot. Now, she voted for Trump. And this is consistent, all right? All of the known gaming of elections in recent years, with only one or two exceptions, involves Republicans. And we've got to remind ourselves that Trump told her to do this. He was actually addressing voters in North and South Carolina as he stumped the country on his mob rally circuit over the past month. He said, yeah, go ahead and test out these systems. because he believed that millions of people would be voting twice and would get away with it. But he really doesn't understand there is decent security in our election systems to prevent this kind of improper behavior. The systems are still hackable to a stunning degree, and there are many other issues related to the way we run elections that scream to be reformed. But the idea of people voting twice, or in Chris Kobach's imagination, crossing state lines to vote twice, is not borne out in the evidence. Well, at the All Hands Facebook meeting yesterday, their fearless leader, Zuck, said that he's convinced that Biden has won the election, and it is reflected on the voter information that Facebook posts. And it's kind of annoying now because anytime anybody puts up something related to the election, there's this little truth box that shows up underneath urging you to click through and get the facts about the election. So Zuck said to his employees, "I believe the outcome of the election is now clear. Joe Biden is going to be our next president. It's important that people have confidence that the election was fundamentally fair, and that goes for the tens of millions of people who voted for Trump." And I agree with that. But they're not interested in the facts. They are continuing on their grievance path. They are victims. And it started with Russiagate, and that, as you know, I believe is fair. But then they just, roll the train down the tracks and blame everything that has happened on somebody, anybody, but Trump. Zuck continued in his address to the workforce. Part of what we're seeing out here are people who are calling for recounts and legal challenges, which in a lot of cases is their right. But I think it's also quite unhelpful that people out there are raising expectations that there's going to be a different outcome than what has been projected. He called out Trump for sharing election disinformation, something he's hesitated to do in the past. Quote, "I think, of course, it is a challenge when the President of the United States is sharing some of these things directly," end quote. This was just a few hours after Trump had tried the Dominion stole hundreds of thousands of votes nationwide from me. And he also, in response to a question from a Facebook worker, said that Steve Bannon should not have been banned from Facebook. And this is where I find the regulation of the standards. It's not a First Amendment issue. Facebook is a private company. Well, it's a public company, but it's not the U.S. government, so the First Amendment does not apply. And he said that when Steve Bannon suggested that Dr. Fauci and the FBI director, Wray, have their heads hoisted on a pike outside the White House, well, that presumes that their heads have been severed from their bodies. That is an overt call for violence. Zuckerberg rationalized it and said, well, we have specific rules around how many times you need to violate certain policies before we will deactivate your account completely. While the offenses here, I think, came close to crossing that line, they clearly did not cross the line. Well, what's the frickin' line, Zuck? I mean, I know people who've been bounced from Facebook, either temporarily or permanently, for really minor posts. And yet they set a whole different and much wider standard for this guy who has repeatedly and brazenly flouted their rules. I just don't get it. Every day I pause for a minute to remind people that I'm grateful for all those who have been subscribers for years supporting my work here at the PBC podcast, and that I'm planning to wind it down as I head into retirement just a few weeks. So my plan is that I'll be winding down this daily news and comment podcast before Thanksgiving. And I will be bringing you a series of interviews on into December with people who I've enjoyed talking with or connecting with over the years of doing this podcast, and some of them actually predate going back before the podcast. So that's what will be coming up in the next few weeks. And then after I finish that, I will be occasionally reposting archived interviews that I think are interesting or noteworthy. So the website and the archives will remain operational and available to you indefinitely. I want to remind people that I leave the door open that sometime next year I may crack the microphone and present some occasional podcasts. If you want to be clued into that, be sure to send an email to peter@peterbcollins.com. And just say, put me on your list. And when you do that, also send your tips for other podcasts or media outlets that you recommend. Many of my listeners are looking for content to replace what I have been providing, and your recommendations will be gratefully accepted here, and I will share those during some of the final podcasts that I issue where I will be interviewing some of you, my listeners. And a lot of people are getting the message. If you have a PayPal subscription, please cancel it. You need to do that deed. I can't do it for you. But, I don't want to have any surprises. And after December 1st, I don't expect to collect any subscription money. And also, I'm ending the paywall here so that podcasts that I produce going forward will not have any restrictions. And that applies to today's in-depth interview with Stephen Shainbart. I'm releasing it to everybody, no subscription required. And Shainbart tells his story that Donald Trump provoked him to decide to move to Canada. And his book is called I Actually Did It. And he did. He's a lifelong New Yorker. He's a psychologist who had a practice in New York. And he decided he couldn't take no mo under Donald Trump. And it took him 3 years to get permanent resident status in the nation of Canada. Here's an excerpt from what Stephen Shainbart went through to get that paperwork and be designated a dual, well, he's still a citizen of the United States, but he is a legal resident of Canada.
It is transactional. They don't have a special immigration policy, at least that I'm aware of, that focuses on bringing Americans into Canada. I had to go through the same vetting as if I was from anywhere else. I talk about this in the book. I had to take a 3-hour exam on my ability to speak English, just like if I was somewhere else. I only know how to speak English.
Yeah.
It didn't matter, so I had to be assessed that way. Everything was the same. And
a physical exam. You had to pee in a cup.
Yes, which I understand. They should make a physical exam of anyone coming in to the country. All I ask is that they use doctors that are competent and can identify basic body parts, the kind like everybody has.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much you want to get into this, but in the book I talk about it, that my application was held up for several months because of a spot on my chest X-ray that they couldn't identify, and the immigration bureaucracy in Canada held on, didn't get back to me for months. Finally, informed me that there was something missing about the physical exam. There was a problem with it. And the problem was the spot on my chest X-ray. I didn't even know. I had to wait months for that. So I had to go for a second chest X-ray. And you know what you don't know. You may know because you read the book, but your readers don't know. The spot on my chest which held up my application was my left nipple.
That is Stephen Shainbart, the author of I Actually Did It, subtitled Becoming Canadian Because of Trump. And I think you'll find it an enjoyable conversation. And if you're like me and you've harbored at least some thought of a plan B of moving to Canada, maybe with Biden likely to take the presidency, you want to put that on hold. But I haven't. We shall see. And it's very interesting because as Joe Biden is swimming upstream because Trump refuses to concede and to cooperate with a transition, at least so far. He is nevertheless moving forward with his transition. And I'm pleased to see the howls that are being heard as he plugs in the usual suspects from the Beltway, including lobbyists, people with ties to corporate interests, people with a history of working in the government with very poor judgment. We'll name some names here in just a second. Even the New York Times has a story here on Friday. Biden is urged to Biden is urged to curb corporate influence in government. And they lead with a quote from Jeff Hauser over at the Revolving Door Project, saying that some of the initial people named to the transition team put us at a high state of alarm. And Senator Elizabeth Warren has encouraged Biden to adopt sweeping restrictions on lobbyists, corporate executives, and prominent corporate consultants. But let's go to the sassy Aussie, Caitlin Johnstone. In her latest newsletter, she writes, this is the headline, Biden will have the most diverse intersectional cabinet of mass murderers ever assembled. And she focuses on Michelle Flournoy. She was Obama's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She was widely seen as a protege of Hillary Clinton, who would have been Secretary of Defense in the Hillary administration. And she has quite a history. She was a big booster of invading Iraq, helping George W. Bush to get bipartisan support. She helped engineer the political and humanitarian disasters in Libya and Syria, and a new escalation of the endless war in Afghanistan. Then she joined Boston Consulting, where the firm's revenues have jumped by a factor of 16, and she makes about $450,000 a year. I don't find that so rapacious, but some people are deeply offended by it. Then Johnstone turns to Susan Rice, who was a national security advisor and UN ambassador under Obama. And I've met and interviewed Susan Rice. She is smart. She is capable. But like Flournoy, she suffers from a history of bad judgment, particularly related to Syria and Iraq. And she, of course, is a top potential pick for the incoming administration, along with Senator Tammy Duckworth, who has for months been aggressively attacking the Trump administration for failing to admit to the bogus claim that Russia paid bounties to Taliban fighters to kill Americans in Afghanistan. And there's one other that Johnstone singles out. That is former CIA Deputy Director Avril Haines, who protected all of the perpetrators implicated in the Senate CIA torture report from suffering any consequences, and helped redact that report, and ultimately, joining forces with Obama, virtually suppressed it. And in a similar vein, Alan McLeod writes over at Mint Press News about the wealth of these individuals. And Susan Rice, through her wealthy husband, who inherited quite a bit of money, since she left the government, she has been able to cash in. She has a board position at Netflix that pays her $366,000 a year, and she was given $2.3 million in stock options in Netflix. And so, she is a wealthy person. I don't consider that a failing nearly as much as I do as I say, poor judgment she showed when she was in a powerful position in the Obama administration. McLeod also takes on Flournoy and her work at Boston Consulting, the $450,000 annual income. But it's also interesting, and I credit McLeod for his critical thinking. He noted that during the campaign, we saw the New York Times publish materials that we're told were Trump's tax returns. And then Biden said famously, well, I've released 16 years or something like that of my tax returns. But we never saw any coverage of what is in the Biden tax returns. He claims that he's a poor man, that he just worked on a government salary and took the train, Amtrak, back and forth from D.C. to Delaware, had free housing while he was vice president at the Naval Observatory. But he and his wife Jill are now worth almost $17 million. And a lot of this apparently comes from his book deal and from paid speeches, the same gambit that got Hillary in trouble back in 2016, but this didn't surface as a campaign issue. And McLeod reports that he gave a speech in January of 2019 in Fort Lauderdale, 1 hour, $134,000. And we know that Obama is cashing in bigly. His book has just been released, and I learned that he and Michelle got $65 million in advance payments for their books. And Obama's been making corporate speeches, but we no longer hear about them or the amounts involved. For your weekend reading, I have a couple of opinion pieces I'd like to recommend. John Kiriakou, the former CIA officer and whistleblower over torture, writing at Consortium News. He opens like this: the politics of the past month have been overwhelming. I've had enough of the disaster that's been Donald Trump over the past 4 years. I've had enough of the Democratic National Committee's demonization of the progressive movement. I've had it that nobody takes third parties seriously. I'm sick of politics. I've always been something of a political animal, but this latest election has just been too much. It has pushed me over the edge. He starts with the hypocrisy of the Republican Party, stating that Trump's margin of victory in battleground states 4 years ago was far smaller than Joe Biden's margin in those states in 2020. Yet Trump has pulled out all the stops to delegitimize Biden's election, apparently with no memory of his or his underlings' actions from 2016. And he quotes Kayleigh McEnany, who is at the White House now, but 4 years ago she said, "You have people trying to delegitimize the president-elect of the United States right now. You have people out there that are calling for recounts that are unsubstantiated based on no evidence." Yeah, these Republicans act like, digital recordings don't actually exist. And you can say something and then just say something else, and nobody will ever compare the two. Later, Kiriakou writes, after Twitter began flagging some of Trump's tweets as untruthful, there was an exodus of pro-Trumpers to Parler. The site now has 6.8 million unique daily users. It's ugly, and it's only going to get worse. And just a year ago, they only had 100,000 users. And Parler is known, he cites Wikipedia, as a bastion of anti-Semitism, homophobia, misogyny, and Saudi nationalism. Oh, that makes it really attractive. And then he turns to Biden. He said Biden already is naming neoliberal war lovers to his national security transition team. Of the 23 people who comprise Biden's Defense Department transition team, 8 are employees of think tanks funded by the country's top defense contractors, including Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. These are the same people and same organizations that help to plan and support the ongoing wars in Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, and elsewhere. How would a Biden foreign policy be any different from an Obama foreign policy? It won't be, because Biden has the same advisors. And then our old friend Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, writing also at Consortium News, makes a case that I find a little unusual and not that compelling. But I have a lot of respect for Ray, and I think his voice deserves to be heard. What he makes of the shuffle at the Pentagon this week is related to Russiagate. And Ray is hoping that those who've been installed, including the guy who used to work for Devin Nunes over at the Intelligence Committee, that their purpose is to facilitate the declassification and release of lots of files related to Russiagate. Now, this is something that I advocate. I want to see those files released. I think they're in the public interest. We should really know if there was something there, because the Mueller report didn't show it. The Senate intelligence report that was just released and claimed bipartisanship earlier this year, it didn't persuade anybody. So I'd be interested in seeing this. But I don't know that Wray is on the right tack here. I'm not really persuaded that these Trump loyalists have been inserted in the Pentagon to shake loose information related to Russiagate. Yesterday, I talked about the loony Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, dangling $1 million in reward money for voter fraud cases. And today, the New York Times is profiling the other idiot in statewide government in Texas. Well, let's say an other idiot, not the. And that would be Ken Paxton, who is the Attorney General. He led the charge to bring the cases that the Supreme Court heard arguments about earlier this week to try to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. Ken Paxton has been a loyal foot soldier of Trump, opposing sanctuary cities and many other issues, including mail-in voting. But Ken Paxton got reelected while he was under indictment. His wife has a seat in the Texas State Senate. She's been there for 2 years. But 7 of Paxton's top aides recently quit, accused him of a whistleblower-style, let me read this again. They accused him in a whistleblower-style letter of committing bribery, abuse of office, and other potential criminal offenses. And they have since resigned, been fired, or put on leave. And this revolves around Paxton's effort to help a friend and a major donor, a guy named Nate Paul. He is a 33-year-old real estate baron, and he ran into some trouble with the law and tried to get Ken Paxton to fix it for him. Paxton cooperated, but it has now blown back on him. And Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito unburdened himself in a Zoom presentation to the Federalist Society. And his central complaint is that his view of religious liberty is not being respected, and that he feels that he's almost gagged, that he can't speak freely about his belief that marriage is between a man and a woman, that abortion is an abomination, and that gun control is God's work. And so this appears to be an emboldened Sam Alito, who knows that he and his allies have 6 seats on the Supreme Court. And if you remember, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg made just a handful of public comments about Trump, she was upbraided and she was silenced. But according to Chris Geidner, director of strategy at the Justice Collaborative, this speech was a hyper-political partisan speech. His message in sum was, I'm free to say this now because we have the votes. Alito's speech fueled concerns that Amy Coney Barrett's elevation could lead the court to revisit basic anti-discrimination protections, marriage equality, reproductive rights, and other issues. Alito spun a conservative victimization narrative in which citizens are threatened in their freedom to speak and act as they please. And you can get out the world's smallest violin and make a sad sound. As I quote him one more time, you can't say that marriage is a union between one man and one woman. Until very recently, that's what the vast majority of Americans thought. Now it's considered bigotry. Well, get a grip, Sam. Things change. You originalist. Well, I'll leave it there. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis. And it is shocking to see the rate of increase in positive cases, positive tests that are called cases. Yesterday, The number was around 147,000. Today, which reflects the reporting from yesterday, it is closing in on 200,000 new cases. The official number, 194,610. And the death toll is clipping along, but not as elevated as what we saw in the spring. It's at about 1,147 reported yesterday. The total death score at 242,000, and worldwide 1.3 million. Now, you'll recall that Trump predicted that COVID would be over about November 4th because it was just an election-related hoax to bring him down. But the way that records are falling is pretty stunning. On Thursday, public health officials recorded more than 150,000 new cases a day for the first time. It was only 8 days earlier the country had its first 100,000 case day. 6 of the last 9 days have set records. Hospitalizations have increased and set a new national record at 67,000. That figure has doubled in under 5 weeks. And I am pleased or relieved that the rate of deaths is not climbing as quickly. But do you want to play the lottery and see if a positive test that leads to an infection that leads to a hospitalization might kill you? Well, that's the calculation that confronts many Americans. There are a lot of people in denial who say, well, it can't happen to me. The outlook is especially dire in the Great Lakes region. Pennsylvania, Indiana, Minnesota all exceeded their previous single-day records yesterday by more than 1,000 cases. Mike DeWine of Ohio, governor, warned that hospitalizations had soared to record levels. Wisconsin surpassed 300,000 known cases this week, an increase of more than 130,000 in just a month. And Trump has publicly disparaged the whole issue. He's disengaged from this battle at a moment when the disease is really escalating. White House aides say the president has shown little interest in the growing crisis, even as the case count skyrockets. The White House task force held its first post-election meeting on Monday. Officials discussed the rising case numbers, the promise of a vaccine developed by Pfizer, and they recognized the service of departing Navy Rear Admiral John Polowich. But Trump didn't attend. And unlike the spring when we were subjected to his 2-hour-long TV harangues, he'd go to the press room and attack the media. In between, he'd talk about the virus and get Fauci and Birx to dance for him. Well, Trump has been more focused on tracking the rollout of the vaccine and watching TV. He has fumed that Pfizer intentionally withheld an announcement about progress on the vaccine until after Election Day, of course, because he's a victim. And by late yesterday, Trump had tweeted or retweeted more than 36 times just in one day, and only one of those tweets was related to the virus, and it was retweeting a post by Senator David Perdue of Georgia receiving 2,000 vials of a new antibody treatment. So he's completely disengaged. And the level of coordination that I think we really need to deal with this second wave or third wave, whichever you want to call it, is completely missing. And this kind of, it's a dereliction of duty. I mean, he swore an oath he's still the president, and he should at least be paying lip service to the strain on the hospital system. But he decided a long time ago that he couldn't win politically by managing COVID, and so we are on our own. It's hard to believe that people signed up for a Caribbean cruise, and they were out there off the coast of Barbados, and that ship has halted its journey after passengers tested positive for the virus. The ship is owned by Sea Dream. It's called the Sea Dream 1. It returned to port in Barbados on Wednesday afternoon after rapid tests on all passengers showed a serious outbreak on the ship. And Linda notes that it's well known by now that rapid tests have a serious problem with false negatives, so there could be far more people infected than they know. More than 130 Secret Service officers who help protect the White House and the president have recently been ordered to isolate or quarantine because they tested positive or had close contact with infected coworkers. There are a total of about 1,300 security officers under the Secret Service, so that's 10% who are in quarantine. And this is partly linked to the campaign rallies that Trump held in the weeks before the election. Don't forget the election night party at the White House that got Mark Meadows and Ben Carson and David, is it Bossie, the lawyer, among others. White House staff largely avoid wearing masks. Many Secret Service officers inside the complex follow that dubious standard. The number of officers who've been pulled off duty creates a major stress on an already overworked team and will force many officers to forego days off and work longer hours, which could leave them more vulnerable to infection. Got some great advice from Rand Paul. As you know, he is a doctor. He's an ophthalmologist. And he tested positive back in March for COVID. And he told Fox News that the 11 million Americans who have also recovered along with him should celebrate. Quote, "We should tell them to throw away their masks, go to restaurants, live again, because these people are now immune." Well, that reminds me of those faith healing things I used to watch on TV where people would throw down their crutches. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Rand. That's really great advice. And experts are urging caution because there are new tracking tools out that people can use to try to evaluate the risk, but they don't always identify every factor that's particular to a specific individual. So free virtual resources, including real-time case trackers and interactive tools, have become available recently, and experts say people should be cautious when using risk assessment tools. Don't rely too heavily on a single source, which could create a false sense of security as the cases continue to surge. Professors at Brown University released an app that estimates a person's chances of getting the virus from specific activities and offers suggestions for reducing that risk. And Georgia Institute of Technology launched an interactive map over the summer that uses real-time data to show the risk of attending events of various sizes in different places. Well, for me at this point, I think it's very hard to evaluate, and the better safe than sorry mantra is probably the one to use. And that's how we feel in California. We edged up into the same territory as Texas. We've become the second state to record its millionth positive test. Hospitals are filling up. The number of people hospitalized has doubled in Sacramento. In San Diego, the city has imposed the most restrictive level of the state's guidelines. In Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, quote, "This is one of the most precious, dangerous, and fragile moments in our fight against COVID. This should be a bright flashing light to all of us to control our behavior, to not do stupid things." And San Francisco has really done fairly well comparatively. The death rate here is 17 per 100,000, one of the lowest rates of major American cities. But the governors of California, Oregon, and Washington issued a joint warning today, and they're asking for a voluntary travel ban, that people not move between the states here on the coast, and that if you do, you should quarantine for 14 days when you return. There is other news. This comes from the World Socialist website and a tip from Carl Howard. James Cobell is a 28-year veteran of the New York City Police Department. He's a deputy inspector. He is also the guy who runs he's the commanding officer of the Equal Employment Opportunity Division, which is responsible for investigating employment and harassment claims. Well, they've just revealed that he has posted over 500 times on a web forum called Law Enforcement Rant, or just The Rant, and that Cobell has left a trail of racist remarks and personal information about his co-workers. His username is Clouseau, and Cobell wrote hundreds of vile posts using slurs and profanity directed against African Americans, Jews, Muslims, others. One example is him saying that Eric Garner, the man who died from the chokehold for selling Lucy cigarettes, he died because of his poor dietary choices, and that Garner should have made an effort to make himself a productive member of society. So this reminds me of a scandal here in San Francisco a couple of years back, when police officers were found texting to each other and employing the same kind of ugly language and virulent thought. And I don't want to indict every police officer in America, but we have serious problems. And despite a summer of marching and the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others, these white cops haven't learned a damn thing. And their arrogance shows that they don't believe that they'll be caught or that they are doing anything that is particularly wrong. Very sad. There's a report at Consortium News today written by Brett Wilkins, who's one of my Facebook friends, and it's a sobering message based on a new study from the British publication Scientific Journals. The world is already past a point of no return for global warming, the report says. The only way to halt the catastrophic damage caused by greenhouse emissions is to extract enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And what exactly does it mean for Earth to be at a point of no return? The researchers describe a threshold which, once surpassed, fundamentally changes the dynamics of the climate system by triggering irreversible processes like melting of the permafrost, drying of the rainforests, or acidification of surface waters. Using a simulation model in which carbon emissions peak in the 2030s and then decline to zero by the turn of the next century, the researchers still found that the planet would warm by 3 degrees Celsius. Sea levels would be 10 feet higher than they were in 1850. And despite this knowledge, a group of bankers convened online, hosted by the French. This was the Finance in Common Summit. It was billed as a way to stress the crucial role of public development banks in reconciling short-term countercyclical responses with sustainable recovery measures that will have a long-term blah, 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 blah. Well, what they did was they issued a statement saying that they will lend money to help expand sources of renewable energy. And they talk about a transition. But even after they were prodded by climate activists, the group would not go further and call for a transition away from fossil fuels. And finally, today, I want to say farewell to Bill Pelkey. And I didn't know Bill that well. We served together on the Global Advisory Council for Restorative Justice International. But I got to know him a little bit from our video conferences, and he was a friend on Facebook. He died yesterday in Alaska of a massive heart attack. And Bill spent this summer traveling from Alaska to Indiana, where he went to Terre Haute, the federal prison where a series of men were executed. And Bill suffered as a crime victim. But despite his own contact with criminals and what you might justify as a desire for vengeance, after that crime event occurred, Bill Pelkey spent the rest of his life fighting to end the death penalty in the United States. Bill, I'm grateful, and happy trails. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. Get them while they last. You're free to share them all over the place. Look for them on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.